basically, there is a very powerful nutritional supplementation happening between blue-green algae and DNA. That cannot happen at any other level. This is foundational in your body. This is foundational in the universe. You following me? So this number 1 can address number 1. It can't really address fully number 2 or number 10 or 150 million. It can't, but it can strongly address it. Now I'm going to give you a picture, and this is not correct, but I want your imagination to have something. If you really study DNA and chromosomes, it's not that interesting. Basically, they're elongated rectangles that are stuck together, and geneticists can say, oh, that's one and this is another one. I couldn't do that, but geneticists can do it. By the way, we're going to make it like it is cement. Your DNA is cement. Now here's the general rule. There's a few exceptions, but not many. If you're 80 years old or older, you probably have strong genetics in the white world community. You follow? Where most of us came from. Africans are by far the strongest genetic pool in the world. Why? We all came from Africa. So basically they are still the strongest. But once they become African Europeans, African Americans, guess what? They get just as sick as we do in 1 or 2 generations. And with that said, in the white world, the strongest genetic pool presently are the Russians and the Poles. Whenever I'm with somebody and they're 100 years old, they say, are you Russian or Polish? Probably 60% of the time they say yes. Why? Because they really didn't water down their genetics because they pretty much were colloquial. They stuck with one another. Yeah. With television and McDonald's and all of that, give them a couple of generations, they'll be as weak and as sick as the rest of us. Now, with all of that said, weak genetics, the younger you are, the more weakness you have. So if you're 80, you may have great ones. If you're 70, probably not. If you're 60, definitely not. If you're 50, absolutely not. If you're 40, you're in trouble. If you're 30, you're really up shit's creek. It gets worse as we get a little younger. And that's why today, the youngest people in North America and much of Western Europe are sicker per capita than people above 65. You realize that, don't you?
Yes. And the reason again is because?
Genetic breakdown in strength. Before we could do a whole lot of really dumb things before we got sick. Now we don't have to do many dumb things and we get sick. You know, we just look at dumb things and we get sick. And so basically, that's what's happened to us. Now, with that said, blue-green algae, if you picture it as being cement, if you pour cement on a day where there's no wind, no humidity, and it's 75 degrees, it's like an 80-year-old genetics. You have a really strong genetic. That cement is not going to crack. It doesn't have little pits in it. It doesn't have little holes in it. But most of us, our genetics were poured when it was really windy. Some of you had hurricanes going on when you had your genetics. And if you look at the genetics, there's a whole lot of pits, a whole lot of holes, and a whole lot of cracks in it. So those cracks and holes and pits are very easy areas for disease to seed in. You follow that? And so the more cracks, the more holes, the more pits you have, that's it. Now, a lot of you may be on the algae. This is confusing. I mean, I understand this because, remember, one day I was from the world you're from, the mentally sick world we call normal out there. And so I was completely flabbergasted when people would say to me things like, take grass and drink it, it's good for you. I'd say, what are you, out of your mind? Yeah. And when they started to talk about sticking it up my ass, I really thought they were out of it. I had no concept of this. When you're young, too, when you're young, you think you know everything. So I thought I knew everything, and I was being educated. And in my educational pursuit, they were teaching me the exact opposite. They were saying, I'm going to die if you don't eat meat. I gave up meat, and I stopped dying. And you don't drink milk, you're going to have bad bones. I have better bones now than I've ever had in my entire life. And so does everyone else I know. So I started to realize, by the time I was in my mid-20s, hey, wait a minute. This whole system out there is based upon fraud. It's not based upon truth. It's based upon marketing. And even those of us who cloak ourselves in science, there's very, very few of us who are really purely scientists. We're being manipulated somehow, some way. It may have been 5 generations ago they started it, but who's funding the science today? That's the problem with it. Who's funding most of science?
Politicians.
Well, not politicians, companies. Who control the politicians? The politicians aren't the bad guys. The politicians are the pawns for the industries. That's what they are. But they're bad because of that. I mean, it's like prostitution. It's that simple. But the truth of the matter is, there's very little pure science going on. Every once in a while, they allow a pure scientific study to come out, just to give a token idea that there's some reality in this. The rest of it is all paid for and bought by the companies that want you to prove something to sell their product. Period. So blue-green algae, I get, is confusing you. Today, you've learned that it was the very first life form. That alone should be impressive to you. You don't know a thing about science or biology. That should be impressive. Wouldn't you want to do something that is so primitive and primary? Of course, the answer is yes. Yes, it has all that protein, it has massive amounts of minerals. But what I'm telling you is that we now have massive evidence in the scientific community of legitimate science that shows it corrects DNA. Not only blue-green algae, but green algae. We'll speak about that. And anyone that's really interested in this, start to read the research. You'll be shocked, as I was initially. Now, with all of that said, what are the kind of algae that we're talking about? We'll talk about different ones. Life-Give Live is a frozen algae. That company was born for human consumption right here in my office. There was a brother and sister here, young brother and sister. He went to every doctor on the West Coast, couldn't get better. Within a matter of 2 weeks after he was here, this guy was like flourishing. And they were all elated. And as small talk, I said, "Where are you from?" And they said, "Klamath Lake, Oregon." We grew up there. I didn't know anyone lived there. I thought they only produced algae. Yeah, it is beautiful. And then I said, "What do you do?" And they said, "Well, we take algae, we freeze it, we sell it to people for their animals." So my light bulb went on. I said, "Whoa." I said, "Why don't you call the Food and Drug Administration, thinking there's not a chance in hell they'll ever say yes, and see if we can start to consume this as human." 2 months later, because they're Oregonians, how many of you know people from Oregon? They're like people from Maine. They do what they say. Yeah. Like shocking. They say it, they do it. Anywhere else we all talk. They're doing Maine and there. That's about the 2 places left, refuge. So 2 months later, they call and say, "Oh, the Food and Drug Administration said yes." I said, "You're kidding me." Because they have 2 phones in the Food and Drug Administration. The one that comes from the pharmaceutical industry, that the guy always says yes, and everyone else, the guy always says no. So this slipped through somehow. Maybe the guy was off on leave or something, and the no phone got with a yes phone at that time. So with that said, we've been blessed for a number of years to be able to use this. Now, my observation is, it is by far the least processed, because what they do is go to the lake, collect the algae, take away most of the water, and flash freeze it. That's important. Not slow dry it, not slow freeze it, but flash freeze it. So you keep most of the nutrient integrity within the product. Then when we take it, we assume now after observation that you get probably about 40 times more benefit, and it's less expensive. Now, I'm stuck, as many of you, I travel, so you can't take frozen algae on planes with you. So I take the powdered form. So the powdered form would be called body. And there's a few of you that are sissies that would never take the first one live, because it tastes like slimy, cold, wet stuff. Slimy. Green, wet stuff. Slimy, cold, green, wet. So, but again, they're less expensive, a little bit more effective. But this is for the body. Remember, this is from the neck down. Let's give you that picture. And a lot of you are put on brain. Not because we want to make you smarter. We think most of you are smart. You wouldn't have been trying to take responsibility for your life. But what we do know is that brain goes through the blood-brain barrier, little ventricles, and tickles and activates endorphins.